So again, welcome everyone to today's webinar for Vistas on sustaining volunteer involvement over time. Volunteers are a key component of most Vista projects, helping to accomplish much of what the project does. In addition, volunteers can provide an important link in the transition from one Vista member to the next. More importantly, volunteers often are central to the sustainability plan for creating change that persists after the Vista project ends. You've been successful in recruiting great volunteers, but now that you've got them, what do you do with them? Your challenge may be developing a system to support all volunteers in accomplishing what they signed on to do. Today, we'll hear from volunteer management expert Susan Ellis on how you can keep your volunteers engaged. I'm your host, Carly Bruder, from the Vista Training Unit. Assisting me today are Robin Stegman and Shannon McGarry, our partners at Campaign Consultation. We're here to assist you during today's session and to help get your questions answered. Now it's my pleasure to introduce today's presenter, Susan J. Ellis. Susan is one of the world's leading authorities on volunteer management. She is president of Energize Incorporated, a training, consulting, and publishing firm that specializes in volunteerism and whose website has won international recognition as a premier resource for volunteer program leaders. Susan is a prolific writer, having written or co-written 12 books and more than 120 articles on volunteer management for dozens of publications. Her column, On Volunteers, appears bi-monthly in the nonprofit Times. She serves as editor of the field's first online journal, eVolunteerism, and as dean of faculty for Energize's Everyone Ready program, which provides online training in volunteer management. Susan is quite familiar with the Vista program, too, having served as a Vista trainer in the early years of the program. We're very fortunate to have Susan with us today. And now, here's Susan to talk about sustaining volunteer involvement.
Thanks so much, Carly, and hello, everybody. I'm delighted to be with you, and I'm really looking forward to our 90 minutes together, which for me are going to fly by, and I hope they do for you, too. First of all, learning outcomes. What I'm hoping will happen by the end of today's webinar is that you'll be able to define retention of volunteers realistically for your program, that you will be able to generate feelings of positive connection at every stage of a volunteer's involvement with you, and that you will create a communication or feedback loop that sustains enthusiasm. And so that leads us to what the agenda is, and I've divided it into 3 parts. In the first part, we're going to define retention of volunteers and the underlying issues about it, and also talk about related trends in volunteering today. In the second part, we're going to talk about building ongoing relationships with volunteers that sustain enthusiasm. And finally, we'll talk about maintaining a positive communication loop. We've designed this so that there will be a Q&A opportunity after each section. After the first 2, it will be through the Q&A box on the right hand of your screen. And then after the third section, we'll open the phones and talk to you that way. But there's plenty of opportunity for you to put comments in and to ask questions. So let's begin. I need to say that it's important to understand the perspective in which each of you may be coming at this question of retention. I'm going to take as a given that you're a Vista member tasked with coordinating or managing volunteers in some way to accomplish your project. The thing is, you may have only a few volunteers or many. You may or may not have recruited them, and there is a difference about working with volunteers that someone else brought on board rather than those that you brought on board. You may be someone on your own, maybe in a very, very small organization, or maybe you are within a bigger organization, but you're the only one who's tasked with working with community volunteers, or you might be part of a larger volunteer involvement strategy. There may even be a director of volunteers within your organization working with you. The other thing, of course, is that you may be starting from scratch, meaning you're literally beginning brand new, or you may have inherited a project already underway. The question is, and this is important in retention, which is what's going on right now? What are you experiencing right now? And I'm going to start us right off with a poll. And if you go to the right-hand column, you'll see that the poll has been entered. You get to click it. The question is, which best describes your situation now? Do you have no or very few volunteers yet? Are you having trouble finding volunteers who will commit to more than short-term roles? Do you have volunteers who joined before you arrived but are now dropping off? Are the new volunteers you brought on board not staying around, or are volunteers generally remaining in place? You may want to have more than one answer, but the fact is that pick the best one and let's see what you come up with. The reason that this is important is that I'm going to be stressing during this seminar, this webinar, that diagnosis is your most important tool. The better you are at figuring out what's going on, the more likely you will then come up with strategies to make things better. And so that's why we're asking about this. As you answer the question, I'm going to move on, and we'll come back once we get the responses showing. But we're ready to begin part one, and I will come back to the answers, as I said, when the poll closes. So the first part is the defining retention and your expectations. We're going to see how you will respond to the poll in a moment, but what I expect is we're going to have different answers. We're going to have a range of answers. There are 197 participants currently logged into this, so we're going to have different people doing different things. The real question for the purpose of this webinar is whether what you have is a revolving door where you lose volunteers as fast as you recruit new ones. This isn't about never having a volunteer leave. That doesn't make any sense, and you'll see as we go through it. But it does have to do with where are we in the process, and are we spending a lot of our time recruiting and then losing people? And we have the results of the poll. Thank you for answering. The majority of you are still very new, 28%, well, not majority of you. The largest number of you have new or very few. And then 24% of you, which is pretty good too, a quarter of you are generally having volunteers stay in place. So you'll be listening to this from the perspective of keeping it that way. So you see, we're, as expected, pretty evenly divided and around across the map. So that's good, and we know that. The question about this revolving door, if you have it, is who is staying and who's leaving? Are the volunteers who stay, those that you are retaining, are they the best or the worst people? And that's an interesting question, because if you're losing your best people, it's even more of a problem than if people who aren't all that great are leaving. Are you losing the newest people, people that you may have brought on board, or are you losing veterans, those who have been around for a long time in the program, which is another objective, another different kind of strategy suggested. The question we're going to look at now, though, is how do you define retention for your program? And I'd really like to think of that a minute. How do you define retention? And what did you base it on? The question of how long should a volunteer stay is often asked of me and of other trainers. How long should I expect volunteers to stay? But here's the fact. There's no external retention standard, no single way that you should be thinking about retention and what it means. That's because, to begin with, you can only define retention in relation to the commitment made by each volunteer at the start of service. So if you're currently putting together a summer program for kids in your neighborhood, and you ask volunteers to be with you for the summer program, if they leave in September, you haven't, quote-unquote, lost them. You retained them for the commitment they made to you over the summer. Now, you may want to re-involve them, which is a different issue, but you haven't lost them. They finished their commitment and they moved on, and that's completely legitimate. Another factor is that it's going to vary with each volunteer role. You're going to have some roles that are planned to be only a month in duration or to end at the time the project is over. There'll be other things where you really need a commitment. And a great example on that one is those of you that are looking for mentors and who are looking for tutors where there's an intensive one-on-one relationship. You really probably will want that role to have a longer duration at a minimum of 6 months or a minimum of 1 year. But that may not be the issue if somebody is helping you in planning a special event. Another thing is to understand that turnover is natural, and I'll talk about this again in a bit. But what you are trying to do and what we're trying to teach in this webinar is how to limit unexpected departures, the surprises that generally are not good surprises. Keep in mind also that retention is an outcome, not a task. By that I mean that I can teach you, you can say, on Monday morning I'll do recruitment. On Monday morning I'll interview some volunteers. You can't do retention. How do you say, today I'll retain? You can't pick that time. And that's important to the theme of this entire webinar, which is that there is a overall premise that says that when you look after all the other elements of volunteer management, and when volunteers therefore feel good about their participation, the result will be ongoing contributions and loyalty and all the rest of it. It won't happen every time, but in other words, the better you are at the best practices of volunteer management, the less likely you're going to have dissatisfied people who are going to drop off unexpectedly, and that's the way we're approaching this subject today. The fact is that if you are losing a lot of volunteers, if you've brought people on board, you thought you had them, and they're leaving, it is absolutely an indicator that something operational needs attention. It isn't how do I get people to stay, it's how do I create an environment in which people will want to stay. So it's not trying to play a blame game as to who to blame, but it's important to recognize that it isn't volunteers do this, volunteers do that. That's a common misconception people have, just as you don't say all employees do something the same way, all volunteers don't do something the same way. And therefore, the challenge is going to be to diagnose actually what's going on. Now I want to ask you a question because we're talking about all these reasons. In the chat box on the right, there's a chat box for you. I'd like you to just put in a few questions, a few thoughts, not questions, a few thoughts about what you think are the main reasons why volunteers leave before their commitment is over. You can answer this generally, why you think in general volunteers leave, or in your own organization. Tell me some of the reasons why volunteers might be leaving. And we're beginning to see, getting jobs. And it's going by real fast, and keep in mind that when you get the slides, as I understand it, the chat is going to be summarized for you as well, so that you'll be able to see what other people said. But looking at this very quickly, I think there's some really interesting things on here, and interestingly enough, it relates to what my next slide is. So as I'll let you continue reading it. But there are many reasons. When you look at this, you're going to see that some reasons are personal. They involve things going on with family, paid work, and other outside demands. But there are other things here that indicate there simply was not a good match between the volunteer and the role in the first place. Or, in some cases, because you may have someone who's been with you for a while and then suddenly leaves, the role may have changed in some way, either that you're aware of it or not aware of it. And somebody just wrote, they're feeling overwhelmed as they have something more or other than they expected. 100% agree with you on that. I'm just looking at it as it goes by. It also could be that things snowballed over time, that they started with a little foot in the water, and then all of a sudden they get lots more work to do, lots of things change, and what it ends up with is either frustration or possibly burnout or boredom. Boredom is a big reason. I will tell you that more volunteers leave because they are underutilized than because they are overworked. And it's interesting because I'm looking and see a whole lot of you have said underutilized and all on it. I'm trying to read and talk at the same time. It's a little bit like patting your head and rubbing your stomach. At any rate, also I need to make the point that the volunteer may be right to leave. There may be something going on that a volunteer shouldn't have to deal with, and that's why this is so much a matter of diagnosis. What is going on? And then also keep in mind that some things just come to an end. So you can see that you agree on a lot of different things, but it's a matter of looking at which really relate to your situation, to your agency, and also to each individual volunteer. This is also not in a vacuum. Volunteering is never in a vacuum. And therefore, part of what we have to look at is we live in a world in which few people make commitments of any sort today. And what I mean by that is, people often don't stay married forever anymore. They don't stay at jobs until they get a gold watch after 25 years. What that means is that we're dealing in a world in which people aren't expecting you to expect them to stay around for a long time. The other problem we have in the volunteer world is that we have a terrible reputation. Our reputation is you put your toe in and big sucking sound, you get mired in the quicksand. Because people will tell you what's the reward for good volunteer work? More volunteer work. And so people, in order not to get sucked in, are going to not say yes right away or are going to want to limit their involvement as much as they can. Another thing that's going on in volunteering today is that, and again, this is part of this whole lack of not wanting to make the long-term commitment, is that many volunteers, and this is particularly true of baby boomers and, interestingly enough, also of millennials, Generation Y, they don't want to see volunteering necessarily as a job. They don't want it described as a job and to fill a slot in the office. What they want is a role with a clear beginning, middle, and end, and to be able to see meaningful results. That means that they're more interested often in projects, meaning I want to work toward the goal, than a shift. I have to come in every Monday at 2 in the afternoon. That does not mean you can't schedule people for shifts, but it means you need to be aware of that lack of interest in endless commitment. The other thing that feeds into this is the popularity of single days of service. We have the Martin Luther King Day of Service. We have the September 11th Day of Remembrance and Service. We have Make a Difference Day. It goes on and on and on and on. And now we even have micro-volunteering. Micro-volunteering, which is done in very tiny chunks of time, even a few minutes, and in many cases can be done by a smartphone. So don't be surprised that the idea of commitment and volunteering might be really unusual for people to think about. So what you have to do is be realistic. No matter how good you are, you're just not going to be able to keep everyone forever. That's just natural. We don't keep paid staff forever either. There will always be factors outside your control. In other words, life happens. Someone can get pregnant. Someone's husband can move to can get a job elsewhere and they have to move, or wife. There can be a change in their paid job that makes it even more difficult to volunteer when they said they would. There are going to be things that happen. And while your project is currently a priority in your life, you're a Vista, you're doing this for the most part full-time. I know some of you might be in special programs, but most of you full-time. But for the other volunteers, for your community volunteers, it's only one of many things they have on their to-do list. That doesn't mean that they don't want to do it well. It just means that they have many things that they are juggling, and we have to be fair about that. The last thing I want to say before we go to our first Q&A is that the pace of life and change really is speeding up. It's not our imagination. We are available 24/7 by technology. We are all working harder. The economy isn't that great, and people have to work as much as they can to make the money they need. So when you have those many demands on you and you feel like your time is getting less and less, sometimes something has to go. And in many cases, especially if volunteering is not really feeling as good as it might be the thing that goes. So what I've tried to do in part one is talk about how we can't approach this as there's an answer, here's the number of hours or the number of months that you can expect all volunteers to be there, and that's the goal you should aim for. What I'd like you to do is think for each of your assignments, for each of your organizations, what is it that you can expect? What should you be expecting? And now, after we go through this question and answer about reasons and trends and issues, I'm going to spend the rest of the webinar talking to you about practical ways that you can do something about all this. So we're not opening the phone lines, remember. So now in the Q&A box, I'd like you to list some questions. And let's see whether we have some questions yet. I'm getting a lot of things about getting in. How do you define recruiting? That's an interesting one. What I meant by recruiting is that that's when you intentionally invite someone to become a volunteer. that means you're either doing a campaign that might be publicity, but publicity is not necessarily the same as recruiting because recruiting is asking, but it's when you are deciding that you need to bring people in. Ideally, and that's a whole other webinar, and I know you've been getting training on that as well, but the truth of the matter is I hope you are just not putting something out there that says volunteers wanted, because that's like saying unpaid people, step forward. What you want to do is do intentional and targeted recruiting for each of the assignments you have available. But that's what I mean by recruitment. I hope that helps. How do you encourage volunteers to truly commit? Let me see if I can get this up a little higher. So here we go. There we go. Okay, and let's see some of the other things. How do you balance giving volunteers projects and respecting? Okay, there are a number of things in these questions that we are going to get to as we go through the rest of the webinar. But I also want to say, I'm sorry. Okay, there are a number of you who've asked questions that are way off topic. They're critical questions. I value all the questions, but if I can, I'm going to promise you frustration in that I can't answer all of them. But the thing is, for example, somebody asks here, how do you encourage volunteers to truly commit? And someone else says, how do you balance giving volunteers projects and respecting staff authority? Well, first of all, the truly commit, and as I said, we're about to get that in a moment, has a lot to do with what your expectations are. Commit to what? I think that you will get people to have more follow-through on their commitment if you're realistic. If what you're saying is, what we need for you to do is to go through this training and then do the work for a minimum of 3 months or 6 hours a month for a certain period of time. But the key is that shouldn't be true for every single opportunity that you have. In some cases, you might say, if we're going to do a lot of training, those of you that are doing mentoring programs or adult literacy tutoring or whatever that you're doing, the fact is that you can be very clear with people that they're going to get training, you're going to be working with them to do it right, and therefore they shouldn't go into it, if they can help it, without a understanding that you need them to be involved for a certain period of time. If they're unwilling to say that at the beginning when you interview them, then that's not the assignment to put them in. You can't hope later you'll convince them if they're not willing at the moment in time. And I will get back to that whole point of making this something that you can plan into your program by having options. The more alternatives you have for those who want to volunteer, ways for them to test the water, ways for them to do things at their leisure, ways for them to do things virtually, all of that will help. If it is a one-time 3 months of the year project, how often should you contact them? Oh, that's a great one, because many of you do have something that doesn't happen on a regular basis, but it happens, as in this case, quarterly or sometimes even once a year. The first thing to ask yourself is there really nothing to do in between those sessions? Not everyone who wants to work at an event also wants to do other kind of volunteer work, but you might ask them. Maybe some of them want to be on a planning committee. Maybe some of them want to interview participants in those 3 months in between to see what feedback they get and what might be done better elsewhere. But I absolutely think that you should at a minimum have some kind of contact monthly, keeping them informed, making them aware, generating excitement for the next program, because people can fall through the cracks. They just drop off if they don't get contacted by you. Like once every 3 months they hear from you, they'll forget. And you want to engage them throughout the year. So I think that's a really good question. Raising funds, we can't do it today. And some of you have asked recruiting questions. How can you make volunteering look cool to the younger generation? Again, that's another workshop, but I will tell you that the younger folks are already deeply attuned to this. Some of it is language. Maybe you shouldn't call it a volunteering. If volunteering raises the image in someone's mind that it's a little old lady in the flowered hat and tennis shoes, maybe it's time to call it, come and be an activist with us. Come and be, and refer to the title. We need you to be a mentor to a younger child. We need you to do this as an internship experience or service learning or whatever else it's going to do. Several of you have asked about incentive creation and recognition. Again, I think that is important, but I don't like calling them incentives. I really and truly believe that unless it's a big paycheck of some sort or it's a major gift, volunteers they're not going to volunteer for you because at the end of it they're going to get the T-shirt. That's a nice little extra, but it's the work itself that motivates people to do it. Another question, someone asked about do I like volunteer newsletters to connect volunteers before and after events. I think, and I'm assuming you're talking about e-newsletters or both e-newsletters and not. I think that's fine, except you need to have a way for it to be two-way communication. I'm going to spend the third part of this webinar talking about a communications loop. And that's because if all you're doing is talking to them and at them for 3 months in between your event, then you're not involving them. You don't even know if they're reading it. You want a way for them to interact, which may be that some of you ought to think about starting an online community. Maybe you should open a Yahoo group or a Google group so that you can have a way to have interaction both with you and with other volunteers. I have, we've got I'm helped with prioritizing here. And actually I've dealt with some of the prioritizing here. And again, these are not all on, they may be important questions for those of you who are helping me prioritize, but they're not on retention, so I can't think of all of them. And then somebody did ask for Vita tax season, how do you keep volunteers? I presume that means that how do you keep volunteers once the tax season is over, which is really a good question because there's not one issue is, what else might these same people be interested in doing? Ask them, don't assume, ask them. But there's a lot of financial planning, a lot of how you keep your receipts and everything around the year so that you don't have to bring them in a shoebox at the end when it's time to do the taxes. And I think some volunteers might very well want to get involved in some of that public education. So it's work with volunteers. Don't think they're your foot soldiers. And some of what you implied, like my control and they're doing it, if you approach volunteers as your staff to order around, it won't work. It's got to be a partnership. And again, we'll come back to that as well. These are great questions, but it's time to move on, and we will have more chance to answer questions as we go. So let's move to the second part of the session, which is building ongoing relationships with volunteers. It's helpful to think about a volunteer's time with you as part of a life cycle, the volunteer life cycle. And you can do this by really doing a mental walkthrough of what happens in each volunteer assignment area as a volunteer moves from having been recruited, being interviewed, having an orientation, getting some training, getting assigned, doing the work. And if you really sit down and do that mental walkthrough, you'll be able to anticipate where the highs and lows happen. Where might someone begin to see improvement or something? If they're mentoring a child, in the beginning, it's both a high and a low to try to establish a relationship with a young kid, particularly a kid who needs a mentor. Might be resistant at first, it might be difficult, it might be frustrating. On the other hand, that's when it's exciting, it's new. But a milestone might be something like, let's say, and it can be very simple things, but helping volunteers to think about, does this prove I accomplished something? One of the mistakes we make is to say to people, oh, come help adult illiteracy, and our goal is to end illiteracy in our community. That isn't going to happen in any of your lifetimes. So what you need to say with each client is, how about thinking if this adult comes to me at one of our sessions and says, you know, I actually read through a magazine yesterday. I've never done that before. Now, that's a milestone. With a kid, it might be the kid calls you or emails you about making sure the appointment time is right. We can come up with milestones, and that's an important thing. And at each point in the process, what tools and information might be needed? Also, is the volunteer going to be alone at some points in the process, or will they be on site with a group? Are they going to see a supervisor or you? And you may not be the direct supervisor, and I realize that. And then even if they have a lot of people around them, is anyone giving this person feedback in any way? Just even being nice to them or saying hello might be that too. And when you look at this life cycle, I think you will get the impression of when is someone most likely to leave. And, of course, you can compare that to your statistics and to the records you keep as to when people really are leaving. I have to tell you that even if you left the webinar right now, if you commit to doing this kind of mental walkthrough and really assess what somebody might be feeling, then and a good question to ask is, how might I feel if I were as a volunteer at this stage and this point? You will be on your way to developing a retention strategy. The fact is that, and I know that you're only one person possibly in your organization, there's a lot to do, but the truth is that volunteers need attention all during their time with you. From the time you recruit them to the time they leave. You really are working on retention from day one. And as I said, empathy helps. How would you feel really makes sense. And here's the good news. I said in the first part of the seminar that volunteers today don't want to make this long-term commitment from the very beginning. They don't want to be the mail-order bride that comes in on the train, marries the person they just met, and goes off and makes it work. However, the good news is that we have anecdotal evidence that volunteers who enjoy doing a project or a one-day event or doing something for you, if it's good, they will say, what can I do now? And therefore, they evolve their commitment over time as they have incremental good experiences. And that's why nurturing people and cultivating people, which is a term we often use in fundraising, can be very, very important. It starts at recruitment, and you need to think about what you say and how you recruit new volunteers. I've already made the comment, if you have only one assignment, and here's a great example. I've done a lot of work with Big Brothers Big Sisters over the years, and some of you who are doing mentoring programs or anything where you're matching a one-on-one, making a one-on-one relationship, whether with a child or a senior in their home or an adult student, what happens is that is a very intensive assignment, and not everybody that comes to you is right for that assignment, but also not everybody is ready to make that kind of intensive commitment. So if all you have is that mentoring or tutoring or visiting role for volunteers, then the only thing you can have that conversation with the person is yes or no. Do you want to do this? Do we want you to do this? Yes, no. Instead, what you want to do is think about what else can someone do to support the system. Let's say that you do have a lot of kids you're trying to match to a mentor. Well, what that means is that you've got young people on a waiting list waiting for a volunteer. Maybe you can create some kind of group activity once a week or once a month, something about, run a ad hoc ball game or something in the park. There are volunteers who might be thrilled to commit to something like that once a month, which really will help these kids while they're waiting, but it gives you another assignment to offer someone rather than simply automatically becoming a volunteer. The other thing is, some people want to work at night. You may not work at night, but they want to do it at night. Can you involve them in that? And in general, can you be more flexible, or you have a certain thing in your mind and everybody has to fit into that work? I think short-term projects are incredibly important, and they are a way that, first of all, you can see if someone follows through. You can get the sense of, are you going to meet your commitments? It's a way for someone to test the water with you. So it's an important idea to have. And this is the whole question of volunteer assignment development is a huge area, and it is beyond what we can cover in this webinar. But I really hope that you will do some research on that and talk to others so that you understand how to do that effectively, because it makes a huge difference. If you dump on one volunteer a huge, gigantic role, they can't do it all, and often that's when they'll leave because they'll say, I just can't, I feel like I'm going to fail before I even start. Another thing, however, is in recruitment is to tell the truth. We have a tendency to want to make volunteering sound easy. Oh, it'll only take 2 hours. We'll only meet once a month. Well, I have to tell you something. A committee that meets only once a month, that's a lie. They meet once a month, but then at the meeting, you generate work you want people to do in between the meetings. So let's put some honesty in here. If you really want someone to give you a weekly commitment for 6 months, you've got to say it. And the reason is, yes, some people will not want to do that. But wouldn't you rather know that before they say yes to something they didn't mean and then they don't follow through? What you're looking for are the fewer people who actually will make that commitment. So honesty is always the best policy. Now, again, you're going to talk about this. It's from the beginning. Now you've got some applicants. You're going to talk about the importance of maintaining a commitment, whatever the commitment is that relates to the role the volunteers do. So if it's an ongoing shift, remember we're agreeing that you're going to be here for X hours on Monday. If it's a short-term project, then you're going to say, I really am hoping that when you start this that we can meet the deadline of a month from now and that you'll be able to get that done. You just keep reinforcing it, and you do it before there's a problem. And one reason you're doing it is to let people know that this work is actually quite important. Then it's particularly if volunteers are going to be working on site with you in some way, not from home or whatever. The question is what happens to them on day one? How welcoming are people on day one? Are they greeted? Are they welcomed? Does somebody have work for them? I have to tell you that I've seen situations where a volunteer comes in, they're all bright and eager to start, and the person they're supposed to report to looks at them and says, oh, yeah, right, it's 10 o'clock. Oh, yeah, wait a second, I'm going to pull something together for you. Well, the message of that is, we may have talked to you about commitment, but here you are, you turned up, you came in on time, we're not ready for you. So from the very beginning, we can undercut our what we say. It's like not just what we say, but also what we do. The thing that's also important on day one is people generally are friendly to a new person. Hi, welcome, especially in the kinds of programs and initiatives that you all are working on. The question is what happens when the day ends. If you're working in a school setting, for example, it's very possible the volunteer will interact with people, but it might be that the volunteer's time ends while class is still going on, while the teacher is talking. So the volunteer may end up quietly slipping out, which is fine, except that means they didn't have any real closure to their shift. So as much as possible, think about what happens. Is somebody saying, how did today go? Do you have any questions? Are you clear on when you're coming back again? Those kinds of things also make the volunteer feel looked at. By the way, recognition has cognition in it. I see you. So those kinds of things are important. If you know that the volunteer will be alone at the end of the shift or is going to slip out, you may need to develop a tickler system for yourself to either call the person that evening or have another volunteer call them or whatever. But that's important. I want to say also that a lot of people fall down on day two. They do great on day one. Day two, however, it's like, oh, okay, I checked it off the list. I've oriented this person. I've said hello to them. Now they're already here. I don't know about you out there, but I have to tell you that I don't remember people's names the first time they're told to me. And most of our organizations don't wear name tags. If you do, you're lucky on that count. But when someone comes the second day and they see somebody who they know they met, but they don't know their name, they get embarrassed about not being able to know who they are. So it's not just names. It's all kinds of things. It's also stuff like, gee, last time I was here, I didn't really need to use the phone. And I know you kind of told me something about the phone, but I'm not really sure. Do I dial 9? Do I not dial 9? Those kinds of things. So that's how you need to be thinking. It's part of the walkthrough. The fact is a lot of people will drop off in the early part of their time with you. And when they do that, they are telling you that the reality of their experience is not what they expected when they signed on. So we're saying up to this point, that you can set the tone for retention in the way in which you bring people on board. Now, once they're on board, we have this whole issue of supervision, which is a word that people define all kinds of ways. I'm concerned about supervision mainly as how we work together once we are on the job. And I need to say that I believe everyone, whether they are a paid worker or a volunteer worker, everyone needs someone as a contact point and as a coach, someone who's there for them, that they know they can go to, that they can ask a question, they know where they get instruction. And that's what I'm really key on here. It's not always a hierarchy. Again, some of your questions made it look like, how do I get volunteers to do this, to do that? That's a hierarchy kind of thing. In some cases, and in fact I encourage you, you may be recruiting volunteers because they are experts in something you aren't, or because they represent an occupation or professional group that isn't in your organization now, or maybe they come from a corporation, you're trying to bring them in. They are not somebody you are above as a supervisor. It's a liaison relationship. It's a partnership, working together. For some people, that makes supervision much more comfortable because you're partnering, not just directing, which is a different thing. As I'm sure you know in your own situation, the dynamics of the relationship with whoever is the supervisor or coach or advisor, whatever, that dynamic is really critical to whether or not the volunteer is feeling good about her or his role. And that's why we're spending time on this in a webinar on retention. Here's the problem. You cannot assume that everyone knows how to supervise a volunteer. That's because very, very, very few people get trained in volunteer management in school. You can become a social worker and never have a word about volunteers in the classroom. You can be a teacher and never hear about volunteers in the classroom. A nurse. There are all kinds of folks that actually work with volunteers all the time, but they've never been taught. And so what they do is they bring a certain amount of prejudice or stereotypes, if you will, about what the volunteer needs or wants. And keep in mind, even volunteers don't necessarily know what they need or want. They bring their own prejudices and their own points of view to this as we go along. The bottom line organizationally is this. You and your organization have a right and actually an obligation to monitor all work done for your clients. In other words, it is not imposing on a volunteer to say we need to make sure that you're doing your work right and to hold you accountable. That is a bottom line that you need to hold on to. That doesn't mean that you have to boss somebody around. It means you have a right to be aware of what's going on and to set standards. Well, what does a volunteer need? It's not going to be very different from what a paid staff needs, but it's a little bit more emphasis. For example, a volunteer needs information of all sorts, and that includes good instructions. Never underestimate the power of good instructions. Some of you shouldn't be writing a handbook, which is something people spend time on. You should be putting together a notebook or a folder online of instruction sheets, how this happens, how that happens. They need an advisor and a coach, someone who says, good job, and someone who gives them advice on how to do things. Mind you, they need equipment and supplies. I know organizations that have recruited more volunteers on a shift than they had chairs because they didn't think about it. But also, if you want someone to be helping a youngster or an adult with literacy, you may want to be sure that during the course of their tutoring session, they have access to, let's say, a computer so they can practice reading online and at the same time gain some internet skills. They need appreciation for the effort that they're putting in, as well as drawing their attention to the milestones they reach, as well as the end goals. One of the things that's different about volunteers from paid staff is around all the time and learns a lot of things by osmosis. It's that water cooler conversation. But when a volunteer is only working a few hours a week or a month, or maybe doesn't come on site. Maybe they're going to do their tutoring or they're going to go coach a basketball game off-site. They don't know what's going on. So one of the things they need is context and continuity, someone to tell them how their work fits into the bigger picture. I also believe that volunteering should be fun. I don't mean that it has to be easy, because hard work can be enjoyable, but it has to feel upbeat. It has to have an environment that has some energy and some enthusiasm. No one wants to give their time walking into some place that feels like everybody has a hangover. It just isn't the kind of environment that you want to get into. And finally, people do want feedback. They want to know that what they're doing is worthwhile, and they want opportunities to experience new things, to learn new things, to grow. What's important is for you to keep aware of how volunteers are feeling, especially if there are challenges that they may have in terms of what they do or don't know, but also in terms of working with the clients. I think that sometimes all people need is a pep talk. Hey, I know this was a hard month. Oh, boy, those kids were crazy yesterday, weren't they? But some kind of acknowledgement and pep talk, it sounds simple. It really actually works. If a volunteer is experiencing stress, and sometimes this could be outside stress, maybe they have a mother who's in the hospital and very sick, you should be aware of some of that and offer breaks and say, would you like to have a few weeks off to take care of this? But, keep not like go take 2 weeks off, but would you like to? In some cases, if they're really having a problem and it's possible, you might consider reassigning them. The idea is to troubleshoot before things become a problem. And maybe not reassigning, but maybe you can take some of the tasks away, lowering the level of responsibility. And in some cases, maybe you want to raise the level of responsibility. Maybe they're bored. Maybe don't have enough to do. It is very important as a technique in this to deal with problematic behavior, not just because you don't want a volunteer to spend their time doing something that is wrong, but also because other volunteers watch how you treat the volunteer who isn't doing good work. And the minute they feel that somebody gets away with something that really isn't appropriate or something that you said don't do in your training, if they begin to feel that, then they feel foolish for following the rules. And ultimately, your best people will leave if your worst people are not held accountable and helped to become better. So it's really quite important. And in some cases, when there is a problem, when the volunteer really is not enjoying it or there's different things happening, figure out ways to talk with them and make it possible to leave graciously with a plan, with an exit plan. But leaving sometimes, as I said earlier, might be the right answer. We're about to go to another Q&A, but this is my last slide in this particular section. And the reason that I've been spending this time on the supervision issue is, as I said, if volunteers feel connected to an individual they trust, they're less likely to simply drop off. So your goal, or whoever is their direct supervisor's goal, is to make them comfortable in discussing changes in their lives and interests, as well as issues in the work that they're doing. I want to make the point that some of you may not personally supervise all volunteers, or you may supervise some but not all. In that case, in other words, you may be recruiting them and training them, but you are assigning them then either to a paid staff member who will work with them in their daily work, or to a volunteer team leader or somebody at another site that's working with them. But when you've recruited volunteers, and if you're responsible for record keeping and assessment and evaluation, you are what I call a liaison supervisor or a third-party negotiator, which means being able to get in there when something is going on. And one of your jobs is monitoring to make sure that whoever is the supervisor or in that role or partner, that's going well. If there's tension or if there's teamwork, that really is your responsibility. So again, this whole section relates to notice that it's a little touchy-feely. It's how you're treating somebody and whether you're aware of how they're feeling. Because ultimately, retention, people will stay somewhere where they like to be. And they may stay at a paying job for longer if they hate it because they need the money. But even then, they'll look for another job. But in volunteering, because the money factor isn't there, because they're doing it as an extra in their life, In fact, they need to like it. And that's what we're talking about here. Has the enjoyment factor still been there? So, we are ready for
hello, this is Sharon Rabb. I know a number of you have to leave at the top of the hour, so I'm going to ask that Susan hold the questions until the end so that she can get to the rest of her really interesting presentation for as many of you as possible.
Okay. I don't mind that. It's just that we've got lots of questions coming in.
Yes, we do.
And I will say the questions, my one concern about the question is they are so all over the map. But
they are.
That's because
but they're good.
Big question. They are good. No, those are good questions, but they obviously will provide a needs assessment for future training. Let's put it that way as well. All right, and in that case, I'll be happy to move on. The third section is maintaining a positive communication loop. The larger your program, the more important communication becomes. Maybe I should back up and say if there are only 4 of you in the office, I sure as heck hope you're communicating. But if you have a number of people, the idea of being in touch with each other, knowing what you're doing is very, very important. And what you need to be aware of, and actually in the handout packet you're going to get from me afterwards when I'm going to send this to you, communication happens all the time and throughout the volunteer life cycle. What you have to realize is that there's intentional communication, there's implied communication, and there's accidental messages. And as I'm sure you know, in everything in life, it's the implied and accidental messages that often communicate far more than the content or the facts of what you are trying to get across. So the question you need to ask is, are your messages received in the way that you have intended? What you're trying to do, and I made a comment about this with the questions before, you want to welcome two-way communication. The question is, again, are you communicating to or with? Some things aren't open to discussion. That includes factual information, rules, laws, facts, instructions, news, updates on progress. That's fine. It's okay not to have a big discussion about something that can't be discussed. But can someone ask a question? Can they share an idea? Can they clarify something? Those are the questions that are important in relation to non-arguable decisions, but you want clarity. Pay attention to tone. You can say, this is the law, without sounding like you're a police officer. You can say, well, the law is, and of course we think that keeps the kids safe or whatever it is. You don't have to say this in a manner that is off-putting to volunteers. Are you sharing it or commanding it? Are you friendly or officious? Is there an implied hierarchy in how you speak? Now, volunteers know that they have a leader, and they know you have more information about something than you do, but I think you all understand pretty well on a gut level what I mean by tone. This is connected to retention because, first of all, no one wants to be left in the dark, but it's even worse with volunteers. They want to know that they're part of the bigger picture, that their small effort adds to the overall effort. But also, what happens with volunteers sometimes, and this is true if you inherited a group of volunteers who've been around a long time, you get a small group of insiders, meaning longtime people who seem to know everything that's going on. They hang around all the time. They know what's going on. Someone who can't break into that insider group is not eventually going to stay with you. They also will be very resentful if they're told information after decisions are made and when there's no room for input. Keep in mind, volunteers are more willing to do work that they have helped to plan. And even if they didn't help directly in the planning, knowing that they were asked or put on alert or could have made a suggestion makes them feel much more a part of the process. In fact, the idea that a small group of people can sit in a room, decide how something is going to be done, and then walk out and get 100 people to do it just because they decided it was a good idea is a little delusional if you think about it. The idea, of course, is that better to surface objections or tensions or concerns while you still can do something about them, because you know what? What the volunteers are thinking might be correct. They may have thought of something that you haven't thought of, and you'll have a stronger outcome if you engage as many people as possible in the process before the work actually begins. Folks, we're going to skip this. We had decided to take this poll out of Part 3, and because of our time, I'm not going to do it. So please, I was going to ask you how you share information. I'm surprised to see that. I'm sorry. I thought it was out. I checked it earlier. But the reason, what we're going to ask is, and you'll see it here. I don't mind if you want to fill it in, but there are many. You're going to get a handout that talks about the many ways you can share information. You can do it in print. You can do it in a newsletter. You can do it in meetings, whatever. But the key is that there are many ways to communicate, and you may need to use more than one depending on what it is. People say to me, well, I sent that email. Yeah, well, great. I didn't see that email, or I was busy that day, and I didn't realize there was something in it. Important things need to be communicated more often. In addition, some people like to see things in writing. Other people need to hear it. So it's a matter of who your audience is. If you're dealing with teenagers as volunteers, texting or instant messaging might be the way to get a message across. If you're dealing with seniors as volunteers, it might be a group meeting. And I don't want to perpetuate stereotypes on that, but it's a matter of being aware of who your audience is. Again, what needs to be shared and not necessarily discussed. When you know that this is something that may create a rumor mill or whatever, provide correct information as promptly as you can. Try to reach as many volunteers as possible. One of the problems of holding meetings to communicate is that not everyone is going to come to a meeting. And then you have to be very clear on how are you going to give the information to those people who couldn't be at the meeting. Because if you only tell those at the meeting, you're creating that insider group I already warned you about. Also, offer to answer the questions or clarify. And what that means is if there's room for input, be clear on how to give it. It's like you have a question, how are you going to ask it? If you just send a newsletter and all it says is, here's the information, that's a command. That's an edict from above. But if you send it out and go, we're going to have, those of you who want to discuss this, we're going to have lunch together. Bring a brown bag lunch. We'll sit and talk about this at lunch tomorrow if you really want to talk about it. Or if you have a suggestion, please respond by email to X, Y, and Z. Again, most volunteers aren't going to act on that. It's the idea that they could if they wanted to. That's the tone that you're trying to set. If people do give you input, it's really important to let them know that the input was considered. There's an old statement about, I keep praying and praying and praying and God doesn't answer my prayers. Well, God is answering your prayers. The answer is no. What we do when people give us advice, we may actually, in fairness, we may have sat at a meeting and considered all the suggestions that were brought in, but we can't accept all suggestions. But we don't report back. We don't say to people, hey, you know what, we got 8 really excellent ideas, and all of them were discussed. Here are the 2 we were able to implement. Or if you know who made a suggestion, if it wasn't anonymous, go back and say, we appreciated your saying that. Here's why that wasn't appropriate at this time or why we had to postpone it. It's amazing how knowing that you were listened to is more important than actually having made the change the way you want it. It's worse when someone feels they gave a suggestion and it's just ignored, because that's like saying, and we have a situation in the volunteer field where we think about hearts and hands. I like to also add the brain and the mouth. Why is this important to retention? Because if volunteers feel that they're part of the process and welcome to participate, they are more likely to maintain their commitment because they're part of things. Now, there are just a couple of other things I want to mention, actually 2 other main areas I want to mention before I conclude. The first is reporting, and the second is recognition, and several of you have asked questions about recognition. Under individual reports, it is not invasive, it is not mean to say to a volunteer, we need you to report on what you do. It's important. First of all, if you don't ask for reports, you're implying that what they do doesn't matter. Go out and do something. Let us know how many hours it took you to do it, but we don't care what you did. That isn't what you mean, but there's actually an implication in that. So asking for a report is important. What you need to do is not expect everybody to write you a long essay about everything. So I'm in favor of creating a short standard form that's easy to submit, whether it's in handwriting on your desk, whether it's by email, or whatever, whether it's a set of questions they can answer on the phone to you, but some structure in a form that says something like, what was accomplished in the period? What did you actually do? Are there concerns? What are you planning next? Those are the kinds of things you want to ask. Now, note that on this screen, sorry that I went by it because I realized I was going to come back to it. A critical issue about reporting is to follow up if you don't get a report. I cannot tell you how often people say to me, oh, yeah, we say we want reports, but no one sends them to us. No one gives them to us. And I think, well, that tells me that you're not going out after them. The newer the volunteer, the very first time they have a report due, if they do not submit a report when it's due, that is when you can pick up a phone and say, hi, I didn't get your report. We really need it. It really is useful. Now think about what you've just done. You've shown that volunteer that you know about them and that you missed something they didn't give you. You're clarifying that you meant it when you said this report is important. If you don't do that, what's the message the volunteer gets? Oh, they didn't notice, they don't care, it doesn't matter, and it only reinforces never sending it to you. You've got to be willing to say this is important, and it should be important to you, so I think it's worthwhile. And I think that's part acknowledging a response. Yeah, thanks, I got your report. I read what you said in there about the question you had. Here's the answer. Those are the kinds of things that create a relationship with volunteers through reporting, and guess what? Remember, I talked about what you need, and you need to be able to monitor and ensure that things are getting done. So those reports ought to ask the questions that help you to do that. Okay, last big subject before I summarize, and that is recognition. Now, recognition is an element of retention, but it is a mistake to think of recognition as something that happens at the end of some kind of service or every April when it's National Volunteer Week. The truth is that what you want to do is recognition is something, again, it permeates and is part of working with volunteers. The minute you incorporate volunteers into your team, as we've been discussing here, sharing information with them, being aware of the continuity, being friendly to them, asking for reports, when they're part of the team, they know it and they feel appreciated. They don't feel appreciated if there's some faceless, non-identity set of hands that you put to work a few hours a month. Again, monitoring accomplishments, not simply hours served. It doesn't matter necessarily. I mean, I realize there are reasons why people collect hours, and that's fine. But if you collect 5 hours for somebody, if 2 people can spend 5 hours with you, they can both spend 5 hours with you, but one of them could do twice as much work in that time. When do you acknowledge the effort put in, not just the time? I'm a big believer in photographs. I think a really terrific kind of recognition is to picture somebody. Take pictures. In a volunteer application form, by the way, you can put a universal disclaimer. I permit you to use my photograph if you take it while I'm volunteering. Put it on a website. Even put it on an old-fashioned bulletin board. Stick it up there and have people able to look at themselves. They love that. Hey, that's me, and that's recognition. We saw you. We were able to take your picture. By the way, make sure you take a picture of the staff, too. Keep a testimonial and a comment log. Keep on top of when someone said, boy, that volunteer did so well yesterday. Keep intentionally on track of what good things people are saying. The ongoing daily appreciation is really critical. Smiling really matters. Years ago, I went to a seminar in Texas talking about Mexican-American volunteers, and the trainer was talking about a study they had done of why some Latinos leave volunteer work. And to their surprise, it evolved that a significant percentage of them said, I was never smiled at, that it really mattered to be smiled at, and I think that is important. It's not enough to say, you did this work, thank you, but to talk about its outcome. Which stakeholders benefited from the work the volunteer did? What did the clients get? What did the agency get? What did the funders get? Giving credit to volunteers by name is very important, and wow, if you really want to make someone keel over, hand write a note and mail it. it's amazing how people see that, show it around, and value it. And you do that when something special happens. So, to summarize, the truth is volunteers hate having their time wasted. They want to see that their efforts make a difference. Again, by definition, volunteers work on a part-time basis, which is going to affect what they're willing to do or not. They will stay engaged if all the elements of good volunteer management are in place. And that means placing the right person in the right role and keeping communication constant and open. Summary, volunteers remain committed if the work they're doing is visibly meaningful, if they feel appreciated for their service, if they continue to learn and grow, and if they enjoy it. They're doing this in their free time. It's recreational, even though it can be hard work. But we also have to add, and if circumstances they cannot control, do not interfere with their ability to continue volunteering. It's not always your fault. So the bottom line on all this is the better you are in general at running an effective volunteer involvement strategy, the more likely that people will retain their commitment for what they originally committed to. And I'm sorry for what we didn't cover, but we're ready for opening the phones and having some conversation.
Thank you. We will now begin the question and answer session. To ask a question, press star 1. The system will prompt you to record your name. To withdraw, press star 2. Once again, to ask your question, press star 1. One moment, please.
And while we are waiting for you to call in, you can stop me when it is. I'm looking at somebody asked here, is it a good idea to have a retention plan or strategy written out? Well, I think that what I've been talking about here is it's integrated into everything you do. You don't head something retention. You can't do retention. Retention is an outcome. So you need to say, how are we going to make sure supervision works well? Are we thanking people enough? And those things lead to retention. So I want you to be clear on what we're talking about here and not frustrate yourself on this. How do we retain volunteers? We use sporadically. And by the way, stop saying use. You don't use volunteers. You use machinery. How do we retain volunteers who join us sporadically? Well, it's nice to have snacks, and that's fine. But I would establish, first of all, I make sure to get everyone's email address, say, we'd like to keep in touch with you. You might periodically have a meeting. You might periodically run a conference call. You might post a video onto YouTube that shows something that happened and say, you might be interested in this, see this. It's thinking about keeping them in touch. What you're doing is cultivating supporters. Even if they only come in a few times, they all have the potential to expand further, and they all are part of the group of people in the community who are speaking about your organization and about your project. Are we ready with a call?
Thank you. To ask a question, press star 1. Laura Bradford, your line is open. I'm sorry, Bradshaw.
Okay. I was just wondering if you had some more ideas for recognition. I thought the idea of taking photographs was really good. And I just need some more ideas.
Okay. When you're saying, do you mean now for informal recognition or do you mean for a formal event?
Just informal, I guess, and formal, either one.
Well, the problem with a formal event is fine, but be careful you don't become a wedding planner. Where you're worried about the venue and the gifties and all that kind of thing. And also the problem with a formal event, it tends to happen only once a year, and so it doesn't coincide when somebody does something. Here's an idea. You might want to do something that I call the victory squad. When a milestone is reached or something really good happened or nice happened, and this is especially useful if you're in a small organization, you can do something like, go to the dollar store and buy yourself a tiara or something and a magic wand and say, I am the victory recognizer, and I don't mean to be silly about it, and you do what your personality is, but the idea, or have a team of volunteers do it, and what they do is you know how when you have a birthday in some of these restaurants, all of a sudden everybody crowds around and sings happy birthday to you?
Right.
This is something that's like, hurrah, 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 you did this and this, and then walk away. Literally 3 seconds. Uh-huh. It gives everybody in the place some humor. It makes the person, yes, feel embarrassed, but they feel thanked. And those people who didn't do the work or didn't know what this person did suddenly learn about it. So that's another idea.
Yeah, that's so great.
Mm-hmm. And I know somebody that thinks like, there are a lot of things like Lifesaver candies or Hershey's Kisses. And actually on the website, there's tons of stuff on the Energize website about recognition ideas. And you'll have the link to that soon. But if you put something on someone's desk with a note, like with a roll of Lifesavers, and you say you were really a lifesaver in that situation.
Yeah. Okay.
Short and sweet, but to the point.
Okay, great.
Keep thinking. And there are lots of ideas out there that if you do some research on it online, you'll find lots of ideas.
Okay, great. Thank you.
You're welcome.
To ask a question, press star 1.
Spencer Cranfield said, doesn't requiring a report create a hierarchy? No. What I was saying about it is, I said in the very beginning of the section on supervision that the organization has an absolute right to maintain an understanding of what's going on with the clients it serves, and also with its staff and with its volunteers in terms of quality control, teamwork, whatever. I am not employed by the people that I consult with, but I'm often asked to give a report on what's been going on, because reporting is communicating. It's not for a report card. It's not to report up. It's to make it clear. And you know what? To make sure that it isn't a hierarchy, you ought to think about, as a supervisor, also reporting to the volunteer what you've been doing in this period around the project they're doing. So it's even reporting can be two-way. I don't mean telling them what your work is, because they're not responsible for your work, but to say, and you might be interested that while this has been going on, I was in our last meeting, we were talking about wanting to get the executive director to add this to the website or whatever. I moved that forward. So then it takes it away from the hierarchy. Is there anyone else on the phone?
I have no questions in queue.
Okay. Well, in that case, we'll keep going on the question. We have plenty of questions here. Jacqueline Brown asked, what if I've recruited 100 volunteers, but waiting to do a variety of job descriptions I'm writing up to send out their applications? Okay. I don't want to depress you, Jacqueline, because I'm delighted. What you actually have recruited is 100 applicants. But I do need to tell you that you did it backwards. You recruited too soon. Because what you must have done was said, we need volunteers, come help us. And now you're trying to figure out what to do with them. You may have 100 terrific people, but they may be 100 people who are wrong for what you need to have done. The other thing is, maybe you don't need 100 people. Maybe you really only needed 20 people with very specific skills. So to me, the issue here is I can almost guarantee you that you're not going to keep most of those people, because some of them will have been the wrong people to begin with. And that will frustrate them and frustrate you. But the good news is there's more months in your commitment as a Vista, and you can start doing it differently. Targeted recruitment is the way to go. You should have learned some of that in the introduction to volunteer management that I was told that you were getting in the roles you have. If not, again, there are lots of places to learn about recruitment of volunteers. I don't know what community you're in, but maybe you can ask your supervisor where you might learn more about recruiting or who you might go to talk to about it. Priam Singh asked, do you risk volunteer burnout if you approach the same group of volunteers, even if it's a large group, for help? Just went with projects unrelated to what they initially volunteered for? Well, the question I have is, why are you doing that? I'm not saying it's wrong, but I'm asking why. Is it because, well, we already have these people, let's give them more to do? Remember what I said about volunteering. If you're a good volunteer, they ask you to do more. I certainly think you should give people the opportunity to do other things, but the question is this group of people the right group of people for the new assignment you have? And I have to encourage you not to think about volunteers as a great mass of people who are interchangeable parts. They are not. They have all, and not only is that a misuse of them, but you also miss opportunities for the organization, because you're not finding out what each person is capable of doing. You may discover that you have somebody who speaks Vietnamese fluently, and that lets you do a program in Vietnamese, but you would never have thought of that if you thought of every volunteer as the same thing. So, and also from what I can tell by your answers to the very first poll question, most of you are not working in gigantic programs. You're talking about a small number of key volunteers. Now, for a special event, it's a bit different. If the only thing on this question is if you end up having a series of special events and you want to ask a group that volunteered for one event if they would like to help at yet another event during the year, that's fine. But otherwise, don't go to people who came in for one thing with something totally different and expect a lot of them to say yes. Anybody on the phone?
Yes, we're here.
No, I'm sorry. Is there anybody called in the meantime?
Oh.
No?
I have no questions in queue. If you would like to ask a question, press star 1.
Okay. Now, do you have any recommendations for convincing staff that supervises volunteers that asking their volunteers for ideas is important? We often have staff that have the opinion that they know best and therefore shouldn't include volunteers in planning. Well, I suspect you know what I think about that. First of all, they aren't their volunteers. They're the organization's volunteers. Those people are not volunteering for those supervisors. They're volunteering for your clients and for the mission and for the cause. But this raises an issue of things, it comes under the category of things that you are not in control of yourself. Because really, this says more to me about your executive director than it does about you as a leader of volunteers. Because clearly these staff have been allowed to work on this and make their own opinion on what they think volunteers are. But remember something I said earlier in the webinar. I pointed out that practically no one gets formal training in how to work with volunteers. So one of the things you might want to do after this webinar is you might want to go to your agency and say, you know what, I'd like to run a little seminar. I'd like to have a staff meeting about volunteers, who they are, what we're doing, whatever. People bring their own prejudices about volunteers. The funny thing is, for some of you, stop calling them volunteers, call them interns, and you'll find that the same staff who won't work with volunteers are perfectly happy to work with interns. Another term today is skillanthropist. You're recruiting skillanthropists. They're the people who want to know about money, so you can say, fine, you've got money donors and we have time donors. Knowledge philanthropists. I'm not trying to be silly with this terminology, but I'm trying to point out that when we label doing volunteer work with different labels, the image of them changes. And today a big area is highly skilled volunteers, which actually is pro bono volunteer work. Used to be pro bono publico, for the public good. That's when people volunteer the same skills and expertise they normally get paid for. So that in the VITA program, you may have people who are bookkeepers or people who are accountants who are willing, usually not accountants because they're busy during tax season, but the assumption that you don't have people who know a lot about accounting may be false. With staff, the idea is to, first of all, work with them on creating the assignment that they really want the right volunteer to help them with, as opposed to how can they help you, and if they become from the day one, how we work about, say it, they become staff helpers. That's a limited role for volunteers, and it's usually not a fair role. My supervisor does not seem interested in communicating and connecting with volunteers, but I have to recruit. How do I do this if she is uninterested in helping or offering advice? Lisa, this is an important question, and it depends on the dynamics of your organization. In that, again, if it's in your description, if it's what you as a Vista have been asked to do, then you need to ask for a third-party person to sit in with you, somebody above your supervisor and you, to straighten it out. And if you need to, go to your representative at the corporation. Actually, I don't know which program you're with. You might be with a national program. But you're not going to have a successful time as a Vista if you are basically not supported in the assignment that you signed on to do. So all I can do here is give you sympathy, but not a lot of help. but I can urge you to go find help because that shouldn't happen. How do I handle a bully from the board of directors? And people leave crying. Well, you know what you just discovered? This person, Shirley McLaughlin, said, I'll read it again, how should I handle a bully from the board of directors? Wait, it just went away. These things are moving as we go. I'm sorry. It was somebody who was so mean to other volunteers they made them cry. I have to tell you that reading that very, very short question tells me that in that situation, every volunteer who has left was right to leave. And the fact is that, again, you can't control your wimpy executive director or this obnoxious board member, who, by the way, is also a volunteer. We often forget that board members are volunteers, and that's an issue here. People don't know, how to handle them. Again, what you've got to do is sit down after an incident happens. That's a teachable moment. Ask to see the person or whatever the dynamics are in your organization and say, here's what the problem is. You've got to lay out for your executive director. You can't say to your executive director, get rid of that board member. But what you can do is go to the executive director and say, look, we have a situation. This is what happened because of what this person did. Here's what we lost because we didn't deal with this person and we're not helping him to do the work better. So in truth, you can approach this from your position of advocate for all the other volunteers. And what you're really asking for is we just have to tell him that this is not the way to behave, and if maybe I can partner with him and teach him something. But at some point, if you, in fact, don't deal with this problematic behavior, do not expect everything else to go well, because you know what the problem is, but you're not dealing with it. Unless, if anybody of my colleagues here on this panel have one last question you think I really should get to, I'd love to hear it. Otherwise, we've got only about a minute or so before we summarize this.
I think we need to move on if we can. Thank you, Susan.
Move on, by all means. Okay, I understand these webinars end with suggesting some next steps for you. And by the way, thank you for the questions you did give. I'm sorry we couldn't get to many of them, but I hope at least we gave you an approach. First of all, I recommend that you review your statistics and what is really happening now. In other words, what is happening? How many volunteers have left unexpectedly? Can you tell at what point in their time with you? Can you tell why? Which roles have somebody is touching my slides? Please don't do that. Thank you. How many volunteers? Which roles have least turnover? Why? And then, and so that you know what's going on. Then I think you want to look at whether you have some entry-level assignments that allow new volunteers to test the water with you before making a longer commitment. We've talked about that in this program. Pledge to respond promptly to volunteer questions and comments. That's a big thing of making people feel valued, that they get an answer to what they ask. Along with that, develop a reminder system so you can acknowledge volunteers when they do reach milestones in the life cycle. And, interesting in terms of what I just said in the question and answer, train those responsible for partnering with volunteers how to do it right. And that's true if it's volunteers working with other volunteers, a committee chair, a team leader. Don't assume they know how to work well with volunteers. So, we've come to the end of my time with you. You are going to get the slides. You are going to get a handout packet with additional information. But what I really want to tell you about is if you've never been to our online website, Energize is energizeinc.com, and this particular link to art.html is our library, our online library. We're the largest website in the world for leaders of volunteers, and we have enormous amounts of information on the site that's free for you, and I welcome you to come look at it. Thank you so much for participating with me today, and I'm now going to turn this over to Carly Bruder, who's going to continue talking about Vista Resources. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Susan, for that great information. I just wanted to point out a few further resources that are available to you via the Vista campus. You all should be somewhat familiar with the Vista campus because you have used the campus to sign up for this webinar. am I sharing? Is my desktop
Yes, we're seeing
shared?
your screen. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So on the Vista campus, if you click on Vistas and then on the work, there's a whole section on working with volunteers. Most of the information that is relevant to this topic is under the Managing Volunteers section. I know in the Q&A or chat someone had asked about examples of volunteer descriptions or volunteer applications. Templates of those can be found here. I want to point out the volunteer management course here, which is the first item. You can enter the course, and there's a whole section on retaining volunteers here. The next resource that I want to point out to you is an Advanced Volunteer Management for Vistas course. This is another course that you can work through. It has information on volunteer recognition, soliciting volunteer feedback, which Susan talked a lot about, and of course, reflection, making reflection the cornerstone of volunteering. And the last resource I wanted to point out to you is the Vista Volunteer Mobilization and Program Development course. And if you click on Managing, this is where you can find templates and examples of volunteer recognition practices, gathering feedback, and training templates. So I just wanted to share all of those examples with you. And now I just will take us back into our PowerPoint presentation.
If you stop sharing the desktop, that'll happen.
Got it. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And so just the last thing that we wanted to point out is that there is an evaluation available to you. I know some people have provided some feedback already in the chat, and we do take your feedback seriously. So please make sure that you complete the evaluation. And like we mentioned before, a copy of this PowerPoint and a summary of the resources and tips available from the chat will be sent to all of you via email after this presentation. And we hope that you'll join. If you have any further comments, you can email us directly at vistawebinars@cns.gov. And we hope that you'll join us for a future webinar. Our next webinar is regarding living on the living allowance, and that's coming up next Tuesday, June 18th at 2 p.m. So thank you all for joining us today, and we hope you found this information beneficial. And again, thank you to Susan for her guidance and incredibly useful information this afternoon.